Okay, so here we go with chapter 4, carbohydrates, the efficient fuel. So as we discussed in chapter 2, carbohydrates contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which is why they're called carbohydrates, because it is a hydrated carbon atom or molecule. And they have been the major source of energy for people since the dawn of time. People have been eating fruits and veggies and starches since people began being people. Carbohydrates, they add variety and palatability to the diet, and they are the most economical form of energy. They not only provide, energy, but also there is a growing sort of recommendation to not only eat the adequate number of servings of grains, but also that we should be choosing foods that have a higher fiber intake as well. Dental professionals need to know about all of this stuff so that they can educate patients about how to modify their carbohydrate consumption in order to get them to eat more whole grains. And in order to get them to eat more fiber, we have to know first before we can tell them, right? And educate the intake patterns that are consistent with overall good health. So we need to, not only tell them, hey, you should eat more fiber, but also maybe give them some examples of what they should be eating in order to do so. Before we get to that classification of carbohydrates, at the bottom of page 65, I want you to kind of go up just a little bit. You'll see that your book is going to abbreviate sugar-sweetened beverages to SSB. So when you see SSBs later, you'll know that they're talking about sugar-sweetened beverages. And then your book also goes into some of the misconceptions that go around carbohydrate intake. And one of them is that sugar is the cause of tooth decay, which we know from chapter 15. It's not the cause of sugar, or it's not the cause of tooth decay. It is a combination of factors, right? There are multiple factors that cause tooth decay. Sugar is just one of those things. And then food with high sugar concentration is more dangerous to the teeth. So that's not necessarily true, right? We know that what's more dangerous to the tooth is the simpler the sugar it is. And we know that it's more dangerous for teeth to have retentive foods. And so we know that just because food has a lot of sugar in it doesn't necessarily mean it is automatically the worst choice. And then the avoidance of sticky sweets prevents tooth decay. That's not true at all either, right? So we know that even if you're avoiding the really sticky foods like gummies and things like that, then you're still going to be consuming like beverages, and beverages will still lower the pH level and cause that acidic challenge. So I just wanted you to see that little section right above that part on page 65. Okay, so moving on to the classifications here. The number of carbon atoms in the molecule is used to classify carbohydrates. So as we saw before, that every monosaccharide has the 6 carbon chains. So then we know that if there's only one monosaccharide there, it's a monosaccharide, and there's only one of them. And then disaccharides are composed of 2 simple sugars which are joined together. We saw in chapter 2 they had the fructose and a glucose make a sucrose, and the galactose and the glucose make lactose. So you're able to see some examples of some of those more popular disaccharides, but anytime there's 2 simple sugars, 2 monosaccharides joined together, you'll see that it's a disaccharide. And then a polysaccharide are more complex carbohydrates, right? And they contain a minimum of 10 units of various simple sugars. I'm not sure what it's called between 2 and 9, or I'm sorry, 3 to 9. I'm not sure what it's called. It's like a simple sugar, I guess. But it's not a monosaccharide, it's not disaccharide, it's not a polysaccharide, unless it has full 10 units of those simple sugars. You can see in your book on table 4.1 that there is the calorie values that go along with some of those sugars that we see. And we also know that temperature, pH, and the presence of other food substances are going to have an influence on the sweetness of the food. So just because, it is sucrose, which is known as the sweetest sugar, it's not necessarily going to be that way if we drink it in a different temperature, or if we don't drink it, we eat it in a different temperature, a different pH, and if we eat it with other foods, it may or may not be as sweet. Sweet is kind of a perception. All right, so turning to page 66, you'll see that we start with monosaccharides. Monosaccharides are the simplest of the carbohydrates, right? They don't need to be broken down at all before they can be absorbed by our bodies. And those that are the most popular are going to be glucose, fructose, and galactose. Those are the ones we're going to talk about in this chapter. Glucose is the only sugar that's transported through the bloodstream that can nourish all of the cells of the body. So glucose is kind of the most important of the sugars, and it's found abundant naturally in a lot of fruits like grapes, oranges, dates, and even in some vegetables like corn. It's found in sweet potatoes, things like that. And then fructose is found naturally in honey and some fruits. Galactose is never really found free in nature. Galactose is physiologically, it is a constituent of nerve tissue and is produced from glucose in the body of a mammal, and that is when they lactate, and that is how galactose is created. Sugar alcohols are going to be formed from or converted to sugar, and they are going to include sorbitol, xylitol, and mannitol. Xylitol is actually found naturally in fruits and veggies, and it's found in like lettuce, carrots, and strawberries. And it's a little bit more expensive than the other sugar alcohols, but it doesn't have that aftertaste that people don't like about those sugar alcohols. And then we have sorbitol, which of them all, the only thing you need to remember is that it's the least expensive. And then the sugar alcohols do not cause sudden increases in blood glucose levels, and they do not contribute to tooth decay. So what's important about sugar alcohols is that for someone who maybe has issues with their insulin or their blood glucose, sugar alcohols don't increase blood glucose. If you look in your book on figure 4.1, that's on page 66 down at the bottom, you can see that there have been some trends as far as sugar consumption, and that overall sugar consumption has stayed pretty high in that total, that blue one, but that corn sweeteners like high fructose corn syrup, things like that, those have increased a lot since 1970, although as you know, they kind of recognize that they're horrible for us, they are beginning to kind of dwindle a bit. Okay, so of disaccharides, when they are intact, they cannot be metabolized by the body, but they do contribute to body functions after digestion, which we talked about in chapter 2. Monosaccharides are absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract without any further issues, but disaccharides and polysaccharides, they have to be broken down before they can be absorbed. The first up is sucrose. It is table sugar, and it's the most common form of sucrose is going to be that table sugar. That's the combination of glucose and fructose. And then next is lactose, and lactose is just the sugar that's found in milk. It's the combination of galactose with glucose, and it's found only in the milk of mammals. And then, well, I guess mammals are the only things that produce milk. Anyway, maltose is going to be two glucose molecules kind of caught together. It doesn't occur naturally, but it can be made either in like making bread or brewing beer. It's present like in some cereals and baby foods and things like that. Okay, so on page 68 is where we'll start talking about polysaccharides. Whenever we have 10 or more monosaccharides in a chain, it is going to be considered a polysaccharide or a complex carbohydrate. This is going to be different from your simple carbohydrates, right? For starches, It's going to be in foods like root vegetables, cereal grains, and the legumes, not legumes, legumes. I guess it's French. And it actually, like the amount of starch that's present in a vegetable is going to increase with its maturity. So if you get like corn and you eat it quickly, then like before it has a chance to sit for a while, then it will taste sweeter than if you let it sit in your fridge for, you know, a week and a half, and then you eat it, it's going to be a lot less, it's not going to be as tasty. And then in contrast, of course, the amount of starch that's in fruit is going to decrease as it ripens. And those carbohydrates, they kind of break down during that ripening process. And so they become more sweet the longer you wait and let them sit. And of course, they'll go bad if you let them sit too long, like everyone does. Cooking is going to facilitate some of the breaking down of like cellulose and things like that. So, you know, if you need to like break something down and make it tastier, usually like with vegetables, if you cook them, they'll be a little bit more digestible, and sometimes they taste better. And then glucose polymers are going to be made up of glucose, maltose, and dextrins. Dextrins are when your body begins to break down carbohydrates, the polysaccharides, and they produce dextrins, which is kind of like the intermediate stage. Like it's not a polysaccharide anymore, but it's not quite digestible yet. So like if you cook some of your foods, then they'll produce dextrin, which are just those smaller molecules. And then glycogen is going to be the carbohydrate storage form of energy in humans. I like how your book says humans, as if it's not also like all animals. All animals store glycogen. And it's stored in the muscle and the liver, so that glycogen is really like readily available. It's right there for whenever the muscles or the liver need to break it down and have that quick energy. And then excess glucose is converted into the glycogen until that glycogen storage capacity is filled. Once that capacity is filled, every other glucose molecule just gets converted into that adipose tissue. The amount of glycogen that our body will typically store is only going to be enough for the energy demands for less than a day. So, you know, if you have one big carbohydrate meal, it's going to store those glycogen molecules for a while, right? But not, you know, for a couple of days. So you have to eat every day, essentially. This is also why you see runners before a marathon, they'll carb load, right? Because they eat a lot of carbohydrates so that they can store that glycogen so that they will be ready for that following morning when they need it. And then we have dietary fiber. So fiber refers to the non-digestible components of our food, but they do have beneficial effects. So just because we can't break it down and absorb it doesn't mean we don't absolutely still need it. We have soluble dietary fiber, which of course that means we can break it down, and we use part of it in our digestion, and it becomes viscous, which the word viscous to me is the coolest word ever. It just means that it's really thick, and so if something becomes less viscous, then it's more kind of runny as far as liquids go. And then a resistant starch is a form of dietary fiber that cannot be digested, as we talked about. Fiber added during the manufacturing process is called functional fiber. Typically, they will add in that digestible fiber, which it can be a good thing. And then the total fiber is the sum of dietary fiber and functional fiber. So when you look at the back of an nutrition label, you look at the back of the item, you'll see that it has fiber, and then it'll say dietary fiber. So the dietary fiber is what you can't digest, and the total fiber is what you can. So you want to have, maybe 1 or 2 grams of that functional fiber in there for you to help to digest things. But you still want fiber that's not digestible as well. Yeah, I feel like that's all I need to say about that. All right, so this is a little bit longer of a slide. We're gonna go, it starts on page 69, and it doesn't end until like 71. The image is there after 71. So the physiological roles, why do we eat carbohydrates? Well, first they're going to produce energy, right? That's like their main deal. And the energy that they give us is, it's used for all of our activity, and it also is for heat to maintain our body temperature. Then the glucose of the carbohydrates we eat is the preferred source of energy for the brain and central nervous system, for red blood cells, and for the lens of the eye. It is crucial that you get glucose because your brain doesn't like to use any other types of energy sources, and your brain is pretty important in energy consumption. So whenever you reduce or restrict your carbohydrate intake, the fat and protein stores, they can be used as the energy sources, but your body doesn't like to use those sources. So glucose is going to be the preferred source, which is why it's the most important. It's the one I make you remember, which is that C6H12O6. And also carbohydrates, they will provide 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate. So you'll get this as we go along, but whenever you're going to look at how many calories the food should have, you'll get 4 calories per gram of carb. And then carbohydrates are also important in the process of fat storage. So whenever you eat enough carbohydrates and you are using the energy that you need right away, and then you convert some of that into your glycogen that you're going to need for the day. Once you hit that max amount of glycogen that you can create and store, all of the rest of that is going to be turned into fat in that process known as lipogenesis, which literally means fat creation. So lipogenesis is the process of creating fat from excess carbohydrates. And then it can be converted into other carbohydrates. So examples of this are going to include heparin, which is used for blood clotting, galactolipins, which are constituents of nervous tissue, and dermatan sulfate, which is present in the tissues of our collagen, which is really important for our skin. And so they help to regulate the metabolism of those things. And then the conversion to amino acids. So the liver can use part of the carbon framework in order to help to produce some of those, part of the carbon framework and part of the protein molecule then create together the non-essential amino acids. So the ones we don't have to eat in order to make, our body makes it. Well, they use carbs in order to make it. And then normal fat metabolism, so the oxidation of fats requires the presence of some carbohydrates, right? We understand that, in the triglyceride, it has to have that, the molecule that the fatty acids all attach to. Well, that we have to eat carbohydrates in order to make. So when fats are metabolized faster than the body can oxidize them, though, those intermediate products called ketone bodies can accumulate. When you have too many ketones in your blood system, or they are completely oxidized fatty products, then it results in ketosis, and we're going to talk about that more in another chapter. And then we have protein sparers is another thing that carbohydrates are known for. So whenever you're not eating enough carbohydrates, your body will then turn to consuming protein in order to get energy, because it is the second preferred source of energy. But if we don't do that, then the protein is allowed to then be broken down and used in those amino acids in order to build and repair tissue. So if you're trying to, build muscle or get stronger at something, but you are going to eat a low carbohydrate diet, well then the amount of protein that you eat is probably going to be prioritized for energy, because at the end of the day, your body doesn't care how much muscle you have, it cares about surviving. And then the next up is intestinal bacteria. So a lot of the carbohydrates that you eat, they have that undigestible fiber, and it serves as a prebiotic for encouraging the growth of that bacteria. And that bacteria is what is going to help us synthesize some of our B complex vitamins and, most importantly, our vitamin K. So B complex is really important for activity level and for energy, but vitamin K is really important for our blood clotting. And we'll talk about that when we get to vitamins, but we do need to understand that carbohydrates and fiber especially are important in feeding our gut bacteria. And last but not least, of course, is gastrointestinal motility. So I've talked about poop more in the last couple of days than I ever have in my life. So gastrointestinal motility, that just means the sort of speed with which your body processes things and moves it along. And so when we eat dietary fiber, and especially functional fibers, it's going to accelerate that transit time, or the amount of time the food sits in your colon. And if we can increase it, then that means that it's not going to cause as much harm as it could. So we want a high transit time, but we don't want it to be too high, right? Because we want to be able to absorb things like we should. So if our transit time is too high, then we end up having diarrhea. And if we eat soluble fiber, it will help us to decrease that transit time, and it'll help to reduce diarrhea. And then if we eat dietary fiber and functional fiber, it will help to accelerate the transit time. So an increased transit time lengthens the duration of tissue exposure to cancer-causing nitrogenous waste products. So the longer that the waste product sits inside our colon, the more likelihood we'll get colon cancer. Another thing is that fiber has, not only a stool softening ability, because some of that fiber helps to retain and bind water, right, which helps to soften our poop, and that makes it more comfortable. And also because it adds bulk to our stool, then it helps to sort of keep the colon from contracting. It helps to kind of keep the lumen of our colon open, right? If you look on figure 4.4, then you'll see the top image there is a colon where things are able to pass through, right? But on bottom is whenever you don't have any fiber in your diet, then you'll run the risk of getting something called diverticulitis, or it's when you get a diverticula. You can see the image on bottom there where some of that colon has kind of contracted and it gets like pinched off. And that's really, really bad. It's going to be those little bulging pouches, and then the waste products get caught in the little pouch, and as from bacteria getting caught up in a sulcus, bad things happen when bacteria gets caught in places. So we want to eat enough fiber, both dietary fiber and functional fiber, in order to prevent and promote health in this part of our body. So soluble fibers are physiologically important for their gel forming ability, which result in an increased viscosity of chyme, right? So that gel forming product of the soluble fibers helps to make the chyme in our stomach and in our small intestine more viscous, right? It's going to make it more thick, and it's going to delay gastric emptying. So that's going to help us stay keep the food there so that we absorb it like we should. And also, really important here, is going to bind bile acids, which, when it binds the bile acids, it's going to help to decrease serum cholesterol levels and help to improve our glucose tolerance. So that's the last couple of sentences in the second to last paragraph of the gastrointestinal motility. That second to last paragraph right there is pretty important. Okay, so as far as requirements of carbohydrates go, we need to look at that acceptable macronutrient distribution range, the AMDR. For carbohydrates is going to be based on providing energy for the body, particularly those brain cells. So the recommendation is to limit carbohydrates no less than 45% of the overall caloric intake and no more than 65%. So as long as we don't eat less than 45% carbs and more than 65% carbohydrates, then it's going to leave enough room for other parts of our diet to fill those other also important nutrients that we're going to need. So in men, this is typically anywhere from 200 to 330 grams per day. And for women, this is going to be between 180 to 230 grams per day. Your book also talks about sugar and how they don't necessarily have a recommendation for sugar, right? We just have kind of an upper limit. So you want to eat less than 20% of your daily calories from sugar and fats. And as long as you eat a total fiber intake of 14 grams per 1,000 calories. So for men, this is going to be 38 grams, and for women, it's going to be 25 grams. What we're seeing is that typically in the United States, even though people are eating enough of the grains, they're eating, enough of their calories in a day from carbohydrates, they're not hitting those fiber intakes. And I think your book is funny because it says that calculating the total amount of dietary fiber is tedious because, not only are you getting fiber from whole grains and from your carbohydrate sources there, but you're also getting it from your fruits and vegetable groups. And so because it's coming from multiple sources, it's kind of a little bit more difficult to determine. But as you guys are probably seeing, if you use like the sort of trackers where you look at your entire day worth of calories, where you get all of your sources of calories, then you're able to see, okay, I'm getting a little bit of fiber from this place, a little bit of fiber from this place, and my total number is whatever it was. So when you turn to page 72, which is the beginning of sources of carbohydrates, and you go just above sources, you'll also see that more than 90% of adults and children will fall short of meeting that daily fiber recommendation, right? Even though 60% of Americans are consuming their intake for total grains, right? Only 8% of them are getting the recommended amount of whole grains. So what this means is they're getting sources of carbohydrates and they're getting sources of grain, but they're not coming from whole sources. And so carbohydrates they come from food groups like milk, grain, fruits, and vegetables. Typically, carbohydrates come from plant sources. The only way you can get a carbohydrate source from an animal product is going to be through milk. And we also see it from sugars that are furnished from table sugar, like syrups, jellies, jams, and honey. Approximately 18% of caloric intake is from naturally occurring sugars, like in fruits and veggies. The rest of the sugar that we get is from manufactured sources. My plate doesn't include a separate section for sugar because it doesn't recommend you eat sugar. It actually just leaves you a couple of sort of free calories to eat whatever you want, and you can eat sugar if you want to, although my plate does say don't eat more than 10% of your daily intake from sugar. The World Health Organization is kind of saying you should probably eat less than that, even just to about 5%, although your book seems a little salty here because they say that the World Health Organization's decision is based more on economic, social, and political issues and not on scientific evidence, which feels like a pretty strong stance to take, but that's okay. So also your complex carbohydrates, those are going to be furnished by the grain products, right? And the fiber is found in whole grains and, you know, some of our veggies and fruits. And so this is tough because a lot of the marketing that goes into getting people to eat more whole grains is really misleading. When you see, you know, foods that claim whole grain, the fiber content could be very, very low, less than 3 grams in a lot of cases. And when it says made with whole grains, it actually just means that there's a tiny piece of whole grain in there. It's made primarily from processed flours and grains. And then what you're looking for is the ingredient list. If the first ingredient says whole grain or whole wheat, then you're probably okay. That's probably an okay source of grains. And then also, if you're seeing the words 100% whole grain, that means that none of the grain product that's in there has been processed. So that's what you need to look for. And then in plants, you're looking for things that have cellulose. So cellulose is found in the stems, roots, leaves, and seed coverings of plants. So anytime you eat something that's unpeeled fruits, leafy vegetables are always a good source of like everything. And then legumes are a good source of dietary fiber as well, because typically people don't remove anything from them. Beans are a really great source of these things. And then your book likes to talk about popcorn too. So as long as you don't put a bunch of butter and salt on it, popcorn can be a very good source of whole grain. All right, so hyper and hypo, the role of carbohydrates, is misrepresented a lot in the press and by a lot of professionals. It gets kind of a bad rep, but no matter what, we break it down. The blood glucose level is taken, especially by people who have diabetes. They take their blood glucose levels a lot. You guys are asking them questions about their blood glucose levels in clinic, and I'm sure you've learned this in your other classes, but I think it's awesome, so we're going to talk about it. But so for hyperglycemia, right, you have too much hyper. That means you have anything higher than 130 milligrams per deciliter before you eat a meal, or after you eat that meal, you have more than 180 milligrams per deciliter 2 hours after you eat the meal. So anytime you have more than 130 kind of at your fasted state, or 2 hours after the meal you're still over 180, then you are hyperglycemia or hyperglycemic. And then hypoglycemia is anytime, no matter before or after the meal or however you want to call that, anytime you have less than 70 milligrams per deciliter. So if you guys have ever been around a diabetic, my grandma was diabetic, type 2, and she loved to take my blood sugar. She'd ask me to do it all the time because she wanted to know what people who weren't diabetic were doing. And so they have those little testing kits. You just like kind of prick your finger and you bleed onto a little stick, and the machine tells you how much blood sugar you have. And so when you're asking your patients in clinic, you're going to be using these kinds of guidelines. Obviously, we don't take their blood sugar in clinic, which is probably a good thing, but this is, when they're giving you those numbers, this is what you're looking for. Okay, so carbohydrate excess. There's a lot of controversy regarding how much of carbohydrates consumed is excessive. And so the dietary guidelines give us an idea or recommendations for how many carbohydrates we should be consuming. And it's hard because if you can consume that many carbohydrates and meet all of your nutritional requirements, maybe all of your micronutrient requirements, but if you continue to consume above that, then there's a lot of controversy over what that means for the individual. So for right now, according to the research, eating more than the recommended amount of sugar and eating more than the recommended amount of carbohydrates does not directly contribute to any chronic health or behavioral problems. So kids that eat too much sugar don't necessarily become ADHD. People who eat too much sugar aren't necessarily immediately, contributing to coronary heart disease. That's not where the link lies. Yes, they do end up having more overall calories, and if they are not then burning that calories, they will store the calorie as adipose tissue. But as long as they're eating enough fiber and they're eating enough of the micronutrient that they need, then there's no like direct link straight over that they're going to get whatever issue there is. As far as the soft drink goes, those SSBs, then we do see the link between like soft drink consumption and like dental caries. And we see a lot of excess calorie intake from soft drinks that are sugar sweetened soft drinks. But it's actually been shown that it's been declining from 1999 to 2015. It's gone down from 53 gallons per capita to 40.6 gallons per capita. So people are really turning towards those non-nutritive sweeteners in order to sweeten beverages and to sweeten foods. Okay, so according to 4 leading scientific health organizations, so the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Health Organization, the National Academy of Medicine, and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, are all sort of concluding that the amount of dietary sugar that is in a person's diet is not associated with causing illness or chronic diseases, including diabetes. Or I'm sorry, not diabetes, obesity. So just because someone eats a lot of sugar doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to cause them an illness, a chronic disease, or going to make them fat. The studies are showing that the more closely associated link with someone getting those diseases and becoming obese are that the types of food they eat, so the energy density, right? How much calorie content is in the foods they're eating, and the pleasure that they get from eating food. That is going to have a higher role in whether or not that person has an illness, a chronic disease, or are obese. The studies are also showing that there is an association, which means it doesn't cause a person to lose weight, but there is an association between someone who eats whole grains, a higher intake of whole grains, and that person having a healthier body weight and fat storage. So because they're seeing the association with a high fiber diet with healthier body weight, the dietary guidelines recommend eating a high fiber diet. That's pretty straightforward. So just like we talked about on the last slide, there are some studies out there that have shown that there is an association. It means that there are people who eat a high sugar diet that get heart disease, right? That means there's an association, but it doesn't prove that people who eat a high sugar diet is going to cause heart disease, okay? This is the difference between correlation and causation. Correlation does not equal causation because there are other studies that show that using moderate amounts of sugar haven't found that correlation, right? So the research is controversial. They are seeing that some people who have a high sugar diet do get cardiovascular disease, and they're seeing that some people who have a high sugar diet don't get cardiovascular disease. So in my opinion, that's no association. If some of them are and some of them aren't, then it means that it's not necessarily being caused by sugar in your diet. So the studies focus on the consumption of the sugar-sweetened beverages, although SSBs are the most prevalent form of sugar intake. They could be like not a true reflection of an individual's total sugar intake because a lot of other foods and drinks in our diet have sugar in them. So it's possible they're studying only one small, tiny variable. This is actually the hardest part about nutritional research because there are just so many variables in the person and their energy expenditure and their lifestyle and their environmental factors. And then to top it all off, like the variety with which we eat foods, which the more variety, the better. That's what they recommend. But the more variety, the harder it is to study. So when we look at nutritional studies, we really have to look at, what kind of claims are they making, but also how did they come about this claim? Like, is it valid? Is the thing that they were trying to study, is it really what they studied, or did they just find something close, or did they even get close? Like, the research is tough when it comes to nutritional claims. Okay, so then on the flip side, carbohydrate deficiency. So what we're seeing now is a trend. It's kind of, I'm sure it didn't start with the Atkins diet, but the Atkins diet kind of gets the credit for it. Of the low carbohydrate, very high protein diets. So the studies show that you don't necessarily have a better weight loss result from those extremely low carb diets. What they find is that there is somewhat of a reduce in calories from that, but when they decrease their carbohydrates, they tend to increase their fats and proteins, and so they're usually consuming a bit more of the others and instead and replacing the carbs. And then when they decide to go back to eating carbs, they go back to eating excessive calories. So diets and weight loss are really only influenced by the number of calories you eat. If you want to lose weight, it doesn't matter how you break down your macros, it matters how many calories you eat in a day. And we have to be careful because very low carb diets will lead to ketosis, and we'll talk about it later. We keep talking about ketosis, but not actually talking about it. And then the complex carbohydrates, remember we talked about how it's important for complex carbs in order to help synthesize some of those B vitamins and vitamin K. Well, when you completely reduce carbohydrates or eliminate them, then you have a hard time getting all of your B vitamins, and you have a hard time absorbing some of the iron, and obviously you're going to have low fiber. So reducing and eliminating carbohydrates can have a lot of negative effects as well. So we're actually going to skip most of this dental caries little page and some bit. It's like a page and a half. So we're going to skip most of it. The only really thing I want you to take from this is on page 77, and it is the sentences between fermentable carbohydrate and cariogenic. So a fermentable carbohydrate are carbohydrates that can be metabolized by bacteria in plaque biofilm. They include all sugars and cooked or processed starches that can reduce salivary pH to less than 5.5. And those are referred to as cariogenic. So I know we learned this in chapter 18, but that's probably the most important sentence on that whole page. The other thing is going to be for dental erosion. So anytime that pH level falls down below 5.5, it can cause cavities, but it also leads to dental erosion. And this is important for us because anytime the pH level is low, we want to be really careful about our teeth. So if you're clenching or you're grinding your teeth when the pH level is low, then because of dental erosion issues, you're going to be wearing away more of the enamel and tooth structures, right? So this also happens when people eat things. So if you consume food and then before your saliva has a chance to reverse that pH level and can buffer that pH level, then you're going to be more at risk for dental erosion and, of course, dental caries, but dental erosion. So if you drink a sugared beverage and then you immediately brush your teeth, or you go to sleep and you grind your teeth, or you clench your teeth during the day because you're stressed out because you're in hygiene school, then you're going to do more damage than you would if your pH level wasn't that low, right? Teeth enamel are actually very they're very resistant to these kinds of things. That's what they're there for. But when we reduce the pH level, they aren't able to do their job as effectively. So yes, we want to know fermentable carbohydrates that are any carbohydrate that can be broken down by salivary amylase, which includes sugars and processed starches, and it has to be able to reduce the pH down to 5.5 or lower, right? This is going to lead to caries or dental erosion. With that same chapter, when we talk about erosion, right, that pH level for dental erosion, even without the presence of a fermentable carbohydrate, is anytime you lower it down to 4.2. So if it's at 5.5, it can cause dental caries when there is sugar, right? The bacteria for dental caries is there, the sugar is there, and the pH level falls below 5.5. But if you're like me and you drink the sugar-free versions of energy drinks, then your pH level could be falling below 4.2, which means if you clench or grind or you brush your teeth at that pH, then you're going to cause more dental erosion. The greatest risk from this is energy drinks, sports drinks, regular sodas, and diet sodas. So while a lot of your patients may think like, oh, I'm going to prevent cavities by drinking only diet soda because, you know, the artificial sweetener, the non-nutritive sweetener is not going to cause cavities, well, it's still going to cause problems. So you really want to encourage your patients to drink just water or milk in order to keep their teeth healthy. Moving right along to non-nutritive sweeteners or sugar substitutes. These are going to be synthesized compounds. We find those compounds that we then change in our fruits, herbs, or sugar itself. We are finding that the consumption of low-calorie and non-calorie sweeteners is increasing more quickly than caloric sweeteners. So there is a growing demand for these non-nutritive sweeteners. Your book talks about how if you combine certain sweeteners, they'll have a synergistic effect. So if you take, maybe xylitol plus aspartame and you combine them together, you'll get a much sweeter taste than you will with either sweetener by themselves. Here in the United States, even though the demand for those non-nutritive sweeteners is going up, so is the American's body mass index. So what we're finding is that even though people are consuming more and more of these sugar substitutes, it's not really helping us as a country lose weight. And the reason for this is because of compensatory food choices, where we basically consume a non-nutritive sweetener, but because we did so, we now are going to eat something that is even more calorically dense than what we would have chosen beforehand. So your book gives the example of maybe you drank a diet soda, but then you turn around and ate a piece of cheesecake because you felt like you could. And we see this a lot. People go to drive-thrus and they'll order, a Big Mac and fries, but then they get a Diet Coke. And it's like, what is the point of that? You might as well just have water. And then the other thing is that there are a lot of consumer questions as far as the safety. A lot of these sugar substitutes are beginning to get a bad rep. They haven't been around long enough for us to truly have researched the long-term effects. However, the research for the shorter-term effects are showing that they're safe when they are consumed in moderation. So as long as you're not drinking 12 cans of diet soda every day, then you're probably going to be okay. Everything, according to the American guidelines, is everything is okay in moderation, right? So the only caveat to that one, though, is going to be aspartame. So aspartame has been shown to be safe in moderate amounts for everyone except for people who have fetal ketonuria. That's a mouthful. And so anyone who has that absolutely has to stay away from aspartame. And you'll see this if you drink Red Bull, for instance, you flip that can over, you'll see that it shows it has aspartame in it because of phenylketonuria. Wow. I've recorded this slide a couple of times now, so I'm not going back. That's going to be the end of the carbohydrate chapter. So next up is going to be protein. If you have questions on carbohydrates, let me know.